So this is actually a really interesting question by Murray. Who were the people who did international law back in 1788, 1770 when Captain Cook, or were they all just cruising around, doing what they want when they want? Funnily enough, there is actually information out there about international law back then, but it's not the same as today. So really, if we look at the architects of colonial law and the how European doctrines were developed, there's like no single creator for those international laws. And Great Britain obviously used whatever laws were around to justify the colonisation of Australia in 1788. In the sense of this, particularly in the sense of these conquests, Terra Nullis was obviously used, and there was a set of principles developed over centuries by European scholars and theologians who applied the colonial powers and interpreted them and helped use those interpretations for their expansionist ambitions. So, as mentioned, the legal framework wasn't actually codified international law as we know it today, but a collection, I guess, of customs, norms, treaties, and scholarly writings back then that had gained authority through European nations. It covered the principles of dispossession and the legality of that, and particularly the legality of dispossession against Indigenous peoples around the world. Intellectual architects behind these concepts were really, really influential back in there, and the European thinkers created works that were the standard references for statesmen, diplomats, and so forth in the 18th century, which of course 1788 comes through. There was a number of books written, particularly The Law of Nations by Swiss journalist Erma Vital. He had a book out in 1758, and that really shaped a lot of argument. And it said that like a nation could lawfully take possession of vast country if its inhabitants were erratic nations who did not permanently build or cultivate the land, and their unsettled habitation of those immense regions can now account for what was defined back then as true possession. So this obviously provided a powerful justification with regard to lands that were, I guess, habitated or inhabited by hunter-gatherer societies, because therefore they could effectively say that it was vacant and available for occupation. John Locke was an English philosopher. I've written a couple of notes down. He had theories on property, though developed earlier, was highly influential. He argued that property rights were established when an individual mixed their labour with the land, and primarily through agriculture. So this thinking again implied that peoples who did not practice European-style farming had no legitimate claim to the land they lived on. So let's look at the legal doctrines of colonial expansion. So by the 18th century, European international custom recognised three primary ways to acquire sovereignty over new territory. One, via conquest, which was the taking by force, territory by force during a war. And in this case, the conqueror was still expected to recognise the property rights of the conquered inhabitants. So Great Britain did not claim to have conquered Australia, as it was not at war with the Aboriginal people. Number two, cession, the voluntary surrender of territory by its sovereign through a treaty. Again, this method was not used by Australia, as the British did not recognise Aboriginal peoples as having a sovereign government with whom they could negotiate a treaty. And three, by settlement or occupation. This was the method applied to lands deemed to be terra nullius. So critically, in the 18th century, the European view of terra nullius did not necessarily mean that the land was uninhabited. It meant that the land was considered to be without recognisable sovereign, a system of law, or established agricultural practices that European powers obviously would acknowledge. So let's have a look at the British experience here in 1788 for what is now Australia. So when the first fleet arrived in 1788, the British government acted on the assumption that the Australian continent for legal purposes was Terra Nullis. And this decision, obviously, as we know, had profound consequences for my people, Aboriginal peoples, and other nations around Australia. So no treaty. So the British did not attempt to sign a treaty with the Eora people, who were the first contact, or any other Aboriginal nation. They had an imposition of English law that the land was treated as have been settled rather than conquered. So according to the British legal theory, this meant that all laws of England were immediately in force in the new colony. Although we do know that that means that Aboriginal people by proxy were supposed to be recognised as British citizens under British law, but we know that that didn't apply. So the denial of Aboriginal sovereignty. So Aboriginal systems of law governance and land tenure were completely disregarded and not recognised by the British Crown. So Governor Arthur Phillip's formal instructions from King George III, issued in 1787, reflected this position. So while they ordered Phillip to conciliate their affections and to live in amity and kindness with Aboriginal people, or them, the instructions made no mention of their land rights, consent or sovereignty. The land was to be granted to the convicts and the settlers as if it were to be unowned. So therefore, in response to your question, in conclusion, international laws that underpinned British colonisation in 1788 were not created by a single entity, but were the product of European intellectual tradition, and most forcibly articulated by, as we mentioned, the figures such as Vattel. And these principles were then selectively or self-servingly applied by the British state to legally justify the seizure of Aboriginal lands in Australia under the doctrine of Terra Nullis. So I hope that helps a little bit.